At her sister's wedding in Lagos, she was not treated like family, but like a servant. While others were dressed in fine clothes and laughing with joy, she was handed trays of food and ordered to serve guests. Some of the relatives mocked her openly, whispering that she was just a maid in her own family. Their words cut her heart deeply, but she stayed silent, holding back her tears as she carried food from table to table. The humiliation grew when a group of guests laughed loudly, saying she didn't belong among them. She wanted to disappear, but her dignity kept her standing. Then, as the ceremony reached a holy moment, the priest raised his hand and called for silence. Everyone turned, expecting a blessing, but instead the priest revealed a truth no one had expected. He announced that the very estate where the wedding was taking place did not belong to the bride's family. It belonged to the young woman they had mocked. The hall froze in shock. The mocking relatives lowered their heads in shame, and the guests gasped in disbelief. The woman who was treated like a servant was, in fact, the true owner of the grand estate. The priest blessed her, congratulating her openly and praising her strength to endure the insults with patience. Suddenly, applause filled the room, not for the bride but for her. Tears of relief streamed down her face as she was finally respected and celebrated. That day, her shame turned into honor, and she walked tall, knowing the truth had set her free. In Nairobi, the wedding day arrived with music, laughter, and shining decorations. The bride wore a gown that sparkled like diamonds, her hair perfectly styled, her jewelry catching every light in the hall. But her younger sister stood quietly in the corner, wearing torn and faded clothes. Those clothes were not hers, they were forced on her. When she had asked for a proper dress, her relatives laughed and said she didn't deserve one. They told her, "You are not important. You can wear this old dress. You are nothing compared to your sister." When she entered the hall, some of the guests looked at her with pity, while others laughed cruelly. "She looks like a beggar at her own sister's wedding," one woman whispered. Another guest said loudly, "Maybe she came to serve food, not to celebrate." Each word was like a knife to her heart. She felt broken inside but kept her head down. She stayed silent, hiding her pain, because she didn't want to spoil her sister's big day. Still, the humiliation was unbearable. Children pointed at her clothes, men chuckled as she passed by, and women covered their mouths to mock her. She stood near the door, far away from the tables of honor, wishing the ground would open and swallow her. She asked herself, "Why am I treated like this in my own family? What have I done to deserve this shame?" Then came the turning point. As the ceremony continued, the priest stepped forward and asked for attention. The music stopped, the laughter faded, and silence filled the hall. He held a letter in his hand, and with a calm but strong voice he said, "Today, before these vows are exchanged, I must speak the truth. The young woman you mocked, the one you dressed in torn clothes, is not a servant, and she is not poor. She is the rightful heir to the family's fortune." Gasps filled the hall. The bride dropped her bouquet in shock. The relatives who had mocked her turned pale. The guests who had laughed at her now bowed their heads in shame. The priest went on, explaining that their late parents had left everything to her: the family fortune, the land, the businesses. She had stayed silent out of respect, but the truth could not stay hidden any longer. At that moment, her tears were no longer of sadness but of relief. The same people who had insulted her now clapped and congratulated her. Strangers came forward to shake her hand, saying, "You are stronger than all of them." The hall, which once echoed with cruel laughter, now rang with cheers for her. She smiled through her tears, her heart lighter than ever. She had entered the wedding as a shadow, mocked for wearing torn clothes. But she left that day shining brighter than anyone else, not because of jewelry or gowns, but because of the truth and dignity that belonged to her. The wedding banquet in Accra was filled with music, laughter, and celebration. Guests were enjoying plates of rich food, clinking glasses, and dancing happily. But behind the bright lights and decorations, one young woman was hidden in the kitchen. She was not treated as a sister, not even as a guest. Instead, she was ordered to wash the dirty dishes while everyone else celebrated. Her hands were soaked in soap and water, her dress splattered with stains. Each time she came out to carry another stack of plates, guests whispered and laughed. "Look at her," one man said. "She's nothing more than a maid." Another woman smirked. "Her sister shines in gold while she scrubs dishes like a servant." Their words crushed her spirit, but she stayed silent. She didn't want to create a scene on her sister's special day, so she swallowed her pain. Still, the humiliation cut deep. Children ran past her, mocking, "Dishwasher. Dishwasher. She bit her lip to stop the tears. How could her own family reduce her to this? She wanted to scream, but instead, she bowed her head and kept working, her heart heavy with sorrow. But then the unexpected happened. The priest, who had been sitting quietly, stood up in the middle of the hall and asked for silence. The music stopped. Everyone turned to him in confusion. With a serious voice, he said, "Before this celebration continues, I must reveal something important." He held a set of papers in his hand. "The mansion you are all sitting in today does not belong to the bride's family. It belongs to the young woman you forced into the kitchen." Gasps filled the air. The laughter died instantly. Plates were set down, and every eye turned toward her. She stood frozen, a dish still in her hands, unsure if she had heard correctly. The priest walked toward her, placed his hand gently on her shoulder, and continued. "Her late parents left this entire estate to her. She is the true owner of this house, this land, and the fortune that comes with it." The hall was filled with stunned silence. The relatives who had insulted her now bowed their heads in shame. Some guests whispered apologies. Even the bride looked pale, her smile gone. And slowly, as the truth sank in, the guests began to clap. Applause echoed through the mansion, not for the bride, but for the sister who had been humiliated. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of relief and pride. The same hall where she was mocked now celebrated her. People who had turned their backs on her now congratulated her with respect. She walked forward, no longer the girl scrubbing dishes, but the rightful owner of the mansion where the wedding took place. That night, she learned something powerful. No matter how much people try to shame you, the truth always shines through. And in that mansion in Accra, her dignity was restored, her honor celebrated, and her enemies silenced forever. The wedding in Kigali was grand. The hall sparkled with flowers, music filled the air, and guests laughed joyfully as the bride walked in, shining like a queen. But while everyone else sat comfortably at decorated tables, her younger sister was pushed to the side. She was not allowed to sit with the family or the honored guests. Instead, she was told to sit on a small wooden chair near the entrance, away from the celebration. Relatives whispered loudly enough for her to hear. "She doesn't belong here," one aunt said. "She is nothing, just extra weight for the family." Another laughed cruelly. "Look at her sitting there like dirt while her sister becomes a queen." Each word pierced her heart, but she stayed silent. She held back her tears, telling herself she wouldn't spoil her sister's big day. When she tried to join the family table, she was stopped. "You don't deserve this place," they told her. "Sit where you belong." The humiliation burned inside her. Children laughed, pointing fingers at her. Guests looked at her with pity or mockery. She wanted to run away, but something in her heart told her to stay. Then came the moment no one expected. The priest stood up, holding a sealed envelope. His voice cut through the music and chatter. "Before this marriage continues, I have something important to reveal," he said firmly. The hall grew silent, all eyes turning toward him. He slowly opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. "This," he began, "is the last will of the parents of these two sisters. And it clearly states that the true heiress of their fortune, their lands, and their businesses is not the bride. It is the young woman you all mocked and pushed aside today." Gasps filled the room. Forks dropped, hands covered mouths, and the bride froze in shock. The relatives who had insulted her turned pale, their faces burning with shame. The priest walked over to the young woman, lifted her from her wooden chair, and said loudly, "This is the true heiress. This is the rightful daughter of honor. Today, you must respect her." Tears streamed down her face as she heard the applause begin. First softly, then louder and louder until the hall shook with claps and cheers. Strangers stood up to congratulate her, saying, "You are stronger than them all." The same people who mocked her now lowered their heads, unable to meet her eyes. The bride, once glowing in pride, now looked empty and defeated. Meanwhile, her sister, the one treated like dirt, stood tall for the first time in years. She no longer felt shame. She was free, she was respected, and the truth had lifted her higher than anyone had ever imagined. That night, in Kigali, a hidden will turned humiliation into honor. The girl who was forced to sit outside the circle became the center of it, not because of beauty or wealth, but because the truth gave her the crown no one could take away. The wedding in Mombasa was like a dream for everyone. Flowers everywhere, music in the air, and guests dressed in their finest clothes. The bride walked proudly, her hand shining with a large diamond ring. She lifted it again and again, making sure everyone could see. People clapped and cheered, But some turned to the bride's younger sister and began to whisper cruel things. "Look at her," one guest said. "Her sister wears diamonds, but she has nothing." Another laughed. "Not even a simple ring on her finger. She must be penniless." The word spread quickly, and soon groups of people were giggling and mocking her. Even relatives joined in, shaking their heads and saying, "She will never have a future. Who would want her?" The young woman heard every word. Her chest ached, and her eyes filled with tears, but she refused to cry in front of them. She kept silent, standing in the corner with dignity. Deep inside, she asked herself, "Why must I suffer this shame? Why must they all treat me like I am worthless?" Still, she chose silence because she didn't want to disturb her sister's big day. But then, something unexpected happened. As the moment for the ring exchange arrived, the priest raised his hand and asked for silence. The music stopped, the hall grew still, and every eye turned toward him. With calm authority, he said, "Before this ceremony continues, there is a truth that must be spoken." He held up a document for all to see. "This young woman," the priest declared, pointing to the sister who had been mocked, "is not penniless. She is the rightful owner of a great coastal mansion here in Mombasa. Her parents left it to her as her inheritance. While you mocked her for having no ring, she already holds something far greater, an estate that will last for generations." The hall erupted in gasps. The bride froze, her diamond ring suddenly looking small compared to the words just spoken. Relatives who had sneered at her looked away in shame. Guests who had mocked her whispered in disbelief. The young woman stood still, her tears now falling freely, but this time they were tears of relief. The priest placed his hand gently on her shoulder and said, "She is blessed beyond what you can see. Today honor her, for she carries a gift that is greater than gold." Slowly, applause began to fill the room. People stood and clapped for her, congratulating her, shaking her hand, and telling her she was worthy. The same hall that had echoed with laughter at her pain now rang with cheers for her dignity. She lifted her head high, smiling through her tears. For the first time, she felt seen, valued, and respected. That day in Mombasa, as her sister flaunted a diamond, the truth shone brighter than any jewel. The woman mocked as penniless walked away as the true heiress of a coastal mansion, her honor restored and her enemies silenced forever. The wedding in Kampala was full of music, drums, and celebration. Guests wore bright clothes, food was served in plenty, and laughter filled the air. But behind the beauty of the day, one young woman sat quietly in the corner, her heart heavy. She was the bride's sister, yet no one treated her like family. Instead, she was the subject of cruel whispers and laughter. "She could not even bring a dowry," one man said loudly. "What use is she? No man will ever marry her." Another woman added with a smirk, "Her sister's dowry filled 3 trunks, but she came empty-handed. She is a shame to the family." The laughter spread like fire, and soon, groups of guests mocked her openly. She heard every word. Each insult cut into her soul like a knife. She wanted to defend herself, to scream that life had not been easy for her, but she stayed silent. She lowered her head and tried to swallow the pain. Tears burned in her eyes, but she told herself she would not cry in front of them. Still, deep inside, she felt broken, as though the world had turned against her. Even her relatives did not defend her. Instead, they pushed her further away from the family table, saying, "Do not sit here. This place is for people of value." Children giggled as they pointed at her, calling her the sister with nothing. It was humiliation beyond words. But then, just as the ceremony reached its most important moment, the priest stood up and raised his hand. The hall grew silent, and even the music stopped. With a firm voice, he said, "Before this marriage is blessed, there is something that must be revealed." He held up a folder filled with documents. "These," he said clearly, "are the legal papers of inheritance. And they prove that the young woman you all mock today is not poor, not empty, and not without honor. She is the rightful heir of her late parents' plantations, vast lands that stretch farther than you can see, producing wealth beyond measure." The hall erupted in gasps. Guests who had laughed at her now stared in shock. Relatives who had pushed her away lowered their heads in shame. The bride herself froze, her smile fading. The young woman sat stunned, hardly believing her ears. All the insults that had crushed her heart suddenly lost their power. The priest walked over to her and gently lifted her to her feet. "She is blessed," he said, his voice strong. "She carries the future of her family in her hands. From this day, respect her as the true heiress she is." Applause broke out, first softly, then louder and louder until the hall shook with clapping and cheers. Strangers came forward to shake her hand, to congratulate her, and to say, "You are stronger than them all." Tears streamed down her face, but this time they were tears of joy. That day in Kampala, the girl who had been mocked for bringing no dowry left the wedding not in shame, but in glory. She was no longer the sister with nothing. She was the woman who owned plantations, wealth, and most of all, dignity that no one could ever take away. The wedding in Johannesburg was grand and full of joy. The hall was decorated with flowers, lights sparkled everywhere, and guests arrived in their best clothes. At the front, the bride smiled proudly, surrounded by relatives who praised her beauty and wealth. But her younger sister was treated very differently. Instead of being given a seat among family and guests, she was forced to sit at the back, right next to the servants. When she walked to the back table, carrying her small bag, people began to whisper. Some laughed openly. "Why is she sitting there? Isn't she family?" one guest asked. Another answered mockingly, "She is not important. She belongs with the workers, not with us." Even relatives shrugged and said, "That's the only place she deserves." Her heart broke as she sat down among the servants, who themselves looked uncomfortable. She felt like she didn't belong anywhere. She wanted to disappear, to hide from all the eyes staring at her. Children pointed and giggled, calling her the poor sister. Some guests even walked past her just to laugh louder. She sat quietly, her hands trembling, fighting back her tears. Still, she stayed silent. She told herself she would not ruin her sister's day. But inside, she asked, "Why do they treat me like dirt? Why can't they see my worth?" The humiliation was too heavy to carry, and she lowered her head, hoping no one else would notice her pain. Then everything changed. The priest suddenly rose to speak. He lifted his hand, and the music stopped. The chatter faded, and the hall grew silent. With a steady voice, he said, "Before I bless this marriage, there is a truth that must be spoken." Everyone turned toward him, confused. The priest held up a document and looked around the hall. "This venue where you all sit today, this very mansion, does not belong to the bride's family. It belongs to the young woman you all ridiculed and forced to sit with the servants. She is the rightful owner of this estate." The words fell like thunder. Gasps spread across the hall. The bride's smile vanished, her face frozen in shock. Relatives who had pushed her aside covered their faces in shame. The guests who had mocked her were left speechless. The priest walked to the back, took her hand gently, and guided her to the front. "She is not a servant," he declared. "She is the owner of this home, the heiress of this land. Honor her today." Tears streamed down her face, but now they were tears of joy. The same hall that had humiliated her now filled with applause and cheers. People who once mocked her now congratulated her. Strangers shook her hand and praised her strength. That day in Johannesburg, the girl who was forced to sit with servants rose higher than anyone else. The truth gave her back her honor, her respect, and her dignity. She walked out not as a shadow, but as the true owner of the wedding venue, carrying pride that no one could take away. The wedding in Lusaka was full of dancing, drums, and singing. Guests clapped their hands, the bride smiled proudly, and the family enjoyed the attention. But in the middle of all the joy, one young woman stood in tears. She was the bride's sister, yet instead of being welcomed, she was mocked. A group of relatives started a cruel chant. "She is the maid! She is the maid!" Others joined in, laughing loudly as they sang. Some even clapped to the rhythm, making it feel like a song of shame directed at her. Children danced around her, pointing fingers and repeating the words, "Family's maid! Family's maid!" Her face burned with humiliation. She tried to cover her ears, but the voices grew louder. Guests stared, some shaking their heads in pity, while others laughed along. She could not hold back her tears. They streamed down her face as she whispered, "Why do they treat me this way? Why am I always the one they insult?" She thought about running out of the hall, but her heart told her to stay. She lowered her head, standing silently as the chants continued, each word stabbing her soul. In that moment, she felt smaller than ever before, like she truly didn't belong in her own family. Then the priest stood up. His voice cut through the noise like thunder. "Silence," he commanded, and the hall immediately grew still. The chanting stopped, and everyone turned to him in shock. He held a letter in his hand, and with a strong voice he said, "You mock her as a maid, but today the truth must be spoken." He opened the letter and read it aloud. "This is the will left by their late mother, and it clearly states that the daughter who inherits the family's fortune is not the bride, but the very woman you all mocked today." The hall gasped. The bride froze, her smile vanishing instantly. Relatives who had led the chants looked down in shame, unable to meet her eyes. The guests whispered in disbelief, shocked at what they had just heard. The priest walked to the young woman, lifted her from her seat, and said loudly, "She is not the family's maid. She is the true heiress, chosen by her mother to carry the family's wealth and honor. From this day, respect her." The hall, which had echoed with cruel chants only moments before, now filled with applause. People stood up to clap for her. Strangers congratulated her, some even apologizing for joining in the mocking. Tears rolled down her cheeks again, but this time they were tears of joy and relief. That day in Lusaka, the song of shame was silenced forever. The young woman who was humiliated as a maid became the center of honor. She walked out not in disgrace, but in dignity, holding her mother's blessing and the fortune that proved her true worth. The wedding in Dakar was bright and full of joy. Music played loudly, guests danced in colorful clothes, and the bride shone like a queen. The long tables were filled with food, and laughter echoed in every corner of the hall. But while everyone else enjoyed the celebration, one young woman carried heavy trays of food from table to table. She was the bride's sister, yet she was treated like a servant. Each time she placed food in front of the guests, people whispered cruel words. "Look at her," one man said. "She is nothing but a helper." Another laughed and added, "She is good for nothing. Her family only keeps her to serve." The words spread quickly, and soon several guests mocked her openly. Some even refused to take food from her hands, waving her away as if she were worthless. Her arms ached from carrying the trays, but her heart ached even more. She kept her head down, hiding the tears that threatened to fall. She wanted to shout that she was not useless, that she was not what they thought, but she stayed silent. She told herself she would not ruin her sister's day, even if it meant swallowing her pain. But deep inside, she felt broken. She asked herself, "Why am I treated like this? Why do they see me as nothing?" Each insult made her feel smaller, as though she had no place in her own family. Still, she carried on, moving quietly from table to table. Then, just when the humiliation reached its peak, the priest stood up. He lifted his hand, and the music stopped. The chatter faded, and silence filled the hall. His voice was steady and firm as he said, "Before we continue this celebration, the truth must be revealed." Everyone turned to him in confusion. The priest held a set of documents high for all to see. "This young woman," he declared, pointing to her, "is not good for nothing. She is the true heiress of her late father's mansion. The very house where you all celebrate today belongs to her." The hall gasped. Guests dropped their spoons, relatives froze in shock, and even the bride's smile disappeared. The same people who had mocked her now stared in disbelief. The young woman stood stunned, the tray trembling in her hands. Could it be true? The priest walked over, gently took the tray from her, and said, "You are not a servant. You are the owner of this home. Lift your head high." Applause slowly began, then grew louder and louder until the hall thundered with claps. Strangers congratulated her, some even apologizing for their cruelty. Tears flowed down her face, but this time they were tears of joy. That day in Dakar, the girl mocked as good for nothing walked out as the rightful owner of her father's mansion. Her shame turned into honor, her silence into strength, and her enemies were silenced forever. The wedding in Addis Ababa was filled with beauty and joy. The bride stood at the altar, shining in her gown, while guests clapped and smiled. But her younger sister stood quietly to the side, ignored and unwanted. Some relatives whispered cruel words that everyone could hear. "She is poor and useless," one aunt said. Another added, "Look at her standing there with nothing to her name. She is a burden." The words struck her heart like arrows. She lowered her head, trying to hide her tears. She wanted to disappear, but her feet stayed rooted to the ground. Even as the bride prepared to exchange vows, a few guests laughed and pointed at her, mocking her presence at the ceremony. Her chest tightened with pain, and she asked herself, "Why must I always be humiliated? Why can't they see my worth?" Then, just as the vows were about to be spoken, the priest raised his hand. The hall grew silent. His voice was strong as he said, "Before this marriage continues, the truth must be revealed." He held up a letter and opened it slowly. "This young woman you insult as poor and useless is, in fact, the true heiress. Her late parents left everything, the land, the fortune, the businesses, to her." Gasps filled the church. The bride froze, her smile fading. The guests who mocked her now stared in shock, their faces red with shame. The priest stepped toward her, lifting her hand gently, and declared, "She is not worthless. She carries the blessing and inheritance of her family. Respect her today." The hall erupted in applause. Strangers congratulated her, while relatives hung their heads in silence. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy. That day in Addis Ababa, the girl who was insulted at the altar walked out as the true heiress, her dignity shining brighter than any vow spoken.